Welcome to the Salt Lake Temple quilt block tutorial by AndiJo Designs. Check out the description and you'll find a timestamp for each unit in this tutorial. Copy your pattern on cheap copy paper. Cut out each unit using your reference page. Label each section in order to make it easier to rough cut your fabric pieces. It's time to cut out our fabric pieces. I like to do strips. I usually start with the largest sections first, and I do all one color fabric with all of the units before I move on to the next. You can do it however you want, but I've just found for me it just makes it easier to do the same color of fabric and then work my way down from the largest section to the smallest section. You'll notice that on that section there is a triangle. Anytime that you have a triangle, a polygon, or an odd shape, I always do a larger rectangle fabric piece to fit that section so that I don't have to worry if it's going to cover that section. And you want to make sure that your rough cut fabric pieces are generously larger than the section that you are cutting out for. You'll notice that I just lay the paper pattern and estimate. With the white fabric, I've cut all of the larger white sections, and now I'm working my way to the smaller sections, and I'm using some of the fabric that I've trimmed from the larger sections to fit into my smaller white sections. I just find that you waste less fabric if you will work from the largest pieces to the smaller pieces. So rough cutting your fabric pieces do not need to be exact, they just need to be generously larger than each section. You can see I'm just using the paper pattern to eyeball the length and the width. Unit A, you'll notice my rough cut fabric pieces are in order that the pattern calls for. The first thing we'll do is grab our cardstock and fold every line on the unit. I find that this is helpful to help your sewing process go faster. So you'll see that the gold spire fabric is pretty rough. It's a scrap piece that I've had. It doesn't matter as long as it's generously larger than the section piece, and make sure that your fabric pieces are in the right order. You'll notice that I backstitch at different points on the unit as I'm sewing. That's so that as we pull off the paper at the end, the seam isn't loosened, it secures it. So make sure you do your backstitch when you get to that black dot on your pattern. Okay, now we're going to section 3 of unit A. We're going to trim 1/4 inch away from the fold. And we'll grab section 3 fabric piece, take it to the sewing machine. Remember, when there's a black circle, we want to backstitch so that when we pull off the paper at the end, it doesn't ruin our seam. You'll also notice on your paper pattern, the lines extended to the seam allowance. That is so that we don't have flaps when we put our units together at the end. To finish unit A off, we're going to trim around the unit, leaving the 1/4 inch seam allowance that the pattern calls for. And here is beautiful unit A. Unit B. First thing is to fold on each line with our cardstock. We fold all the way across the pattern. Notice that I have a triangle. I'm going to line up my fabric on the line between sections 1 and 2 as shown. I place 1/4 inch fabric past that fold. We sew through the seam allowance, backstitch at the black dot, sew down the line, another black dot, backstitch, sew through the seam allowance. As we iron, we give a little pressure with that fabric piece to open up the seam. We're going to trim 1/4 inch from the fold. Line up our section 3 fabric piece and sew down the line, backstitch. a little pressure on that piece to open up the seam. And trim around our unit. You'll notice that the pattern already has the 1/4 inch seam allowance for you, so you just line up your ruler with the line on the pattern, and that completes Unit B. Unit E. First thing we do is fold on our lines. Remember, using our cardstock, we fold all the way across the pattern. We're going to start with the center piece. Folds between sections 1 and 2. It's a small line. Normally I trim this to a 1/4 inch, but I'm going to show you on this one that I don't, and on others I will show you that I do. I'm going to grab this small section 2 piece. I'm going to use the light and look through that fabric. You'll notice I can see that 1/4 inch through the fabric, and I'm going to use the sewing machine to put pressure on my pattern and my fabric. Backstitch at the black circle, and you'll see it looks a little messy, so now I'm going to trim a 1/4 inch away from the fold, clean that up a little bit, and press that back. Now I'm going to fold on the line between section 1 and 3, trim a 1/4 inch, line up section 3 fabric. Now where I fold it, I can tell that it's going to cover that section. Backstitch at the black dot, fold over and press. Now some of you might not be able to see how I've lined up the fabric, but you can see through the pattern, and also you can see the folds where you folded at the beginning. Trim a 1/4 inch away from the fold, line up the next section fabric. Again, I see the fold, so I know where to place the fabric, and I can also see through the pattern. It does help to use copy paper that's cheap and thin. As you work through your units, they don't look pretty, they look a little bit messy, but as you trim and iron, in the end they look precise and exact. Next we have Unit F. First thing we do is use our cardstock to fold all of our lines before we start each unit, and we fold all the way across the pattern. Remember, put your fabric pieces in order. We're going to start with the center piece. We're going to fold on the line between section 1 and 2. Trim that piece. In section E, we started without trimming. That's one way to do it, and here's the other way. We trim, and that way we can line up our fold with our fabric just in case it gets shifted. Take section 2, line it up, and sew. Now, you'll notice that your folds on your line will show you where each section is, and you can also see through the paper so that you can line up those smaller section fabric pieces. Now we're going to fold on the line between section 1 and 3, trim 1/4 inch. You can see through the paper and the lines on the fold to line up that small piece. Remember the black dot, backstitch at those so that we can reinforce our seam. The steps in the rest of this unit are repetitive, so I'll let you watch and I'll come back at the end of this unit. Unit G. First thing is to grab our cardstock, fold on every line of the unit, folding all the way across the paper. Our section 1 is a centerpiece, so we're going to hold it up to the light to make sure we're covering the section. We're going to trim 1/4 inch away from the fold. I do this first usually so that if my fabric shifts, I can line it back up with that fold. Grab our smaller section 2 piece. I can tell where to place it because of my fold and also because my paper is cheap and I can see through it. Remember, the black dots are a back stitch so that when we pull off the paper pattern at the end, we won't interrupt the seam, it will stay taut. Now we'll fold between section 1 and 3 and trim 1/4 inch from the fold. The rest of this unit is repetitive. The one tip that I can give for these bigger pieces is use your sewing machine to apply pressure when you place your fabric on there to slide your fabric around, and then use your fingers to spread your paper and your fabric so that it's laying flat right before you start to stitch. How do you know where to place your fabric piece on a section that's in the middle? You can see the folds in your line and you can also see through your paper. It looks a little messy, especially with the smaller pieces, but as you iron and trim and complete your unit, it will all come together and it will look precise. Now that we've completed all the sections, we're going to turn it over and trim 1/4 of an inch. We already have our 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on that, so we just line our ruler up with the line on the pattern. You'll notice I don't trim the strings until the end because I just can quickly do it on the paper pattern side. Unit C. This unit is very straightforward, pretty simple. Just make sure that your fabric pieces are in the right order. We fold all of our lines first with our cardstock. Remember that the black dot on your pattern means to backstitch. We want to backstitch where there's a black dot so that we can reinforce that seam as we pull off the paper pattern. At the end, we want to make sure that we keep that seam nice and taut. You'll see as I put my fabric together, I use the sewing machine and apply pressure to make sure that my fabric and my paper are flat before I begin sewing. Unit D. First, we're going to grab our cardstock and fold on every line all the way across the pattern. Our first section is in the middle, so we're going to fold on the line between section 1 and 2, and we're going to make a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to trim first so that I can keep my fabric lined up. If I shift that fabric, I can still line it up just as so with that 1/4 inch. I can see the fold on the back of my paper, and I'm going to put section 2 fabric right behind that. Use the sewing machine to apply pressure and slide my paper and my fabric and begin to sew. Remember, when you come upon a black dot, do your back stitch so that we can reinforce the paper pattern when we pull it off at the end. We want to make sure that seam stays nice and taut. The steps in this unit are repetitive, so I will come back at the end of this unit and comment. As we finish this unit, I always use my scissors to cut the strings at the very end, and they are usually on the side of the paper pattern, so you just quickly cut those little strings. And there you have it, Unit D. Unit E. The first thing we do is grab our cardstock and fold on all of the lines all the way across the paper pattern. Our first section is in the middle. We're going to place our fabric up into the light to make sure we cover that section. Fold on the line between section 1 and 2. Give it a 1/4 inch trim from the fold. We can always line that center section up with the fold if it gets moved, just as I have shown. Grab your fabric section 2. Because I've folded my pattern at the beginning and I have cheap copy paper, I can place that section 2 fabric right where it needs to be. Remember to backstitch at the black dot so that we can keep our seam nice and taut. We also want to sew through the seam allowance when the pattern instructs so that we can avoid flaps when we put all our units together at the end. The steps in this unit are repetitive, so I will let you watch and I'll come back at the end of this unit and comment. Now that the unit is complete, we're going to trim a 1/4 inch around it. We already have the 1/4 inch seam allowance on the pattern. I always trim my strings at the end. Most of the strings are on the paper pattern side and it makes it a quick process. Unit F. First thing we do is pull our cardstock out and fold on all of our lines all the way across the paper pattern. This unit's a little bit different than the rest. We're going to have smaller pieces starting off in the middle of our pattern, so we want to make sure that our fabric pieces are in the right order. That's where labeling comes in handy. It allows us to double check ourselves. Carefully hold your fabric and your pattern together and slide that under your needle. Backstitch at your black dot. Make sure you do that so that you have a nice tight seam when we pull off the paper at the end. Next, we're going to fold between lines 1 and 3. Trim a 1/4 inch. The rest of this unit is pretty repetitive, so I'll come back at the end of this unit. Here in a moment, my last piece is going to get caught in the machine, and I'm just going to adjust it. It's a little gathered, so I'm going to pull it out and iron it out. Now that this unit is finished, I'm going to trim around the edges. I already have my 1/4 inch seam allowance on the pattern, so I'm going to line up my line on the paper and cut around the edges. This is one reason why I love paper piecing, because you can take a piece like this in detail and make it look really nice and professional. Unit G. This is one of my favorite units of this pattern because it's so detailed and you need precise work to make it look good. The first thing that we do is get our cardstock and fold all of our lines on our pattern unit. For our first section, it's right in the middle. So we're going to put that fabric piece right in the middle of that paper pattern. We're going to fold on the line between sections 1 and 2. Since it's a small piece, I'm just going to use my scissors to eyeball 1/4 inch seam allowance. I take my section 2 fabric piece, using all my fingers holding onto the pattern and the fabric. I'm going to slide that underneath my needle. When you see a black dot, do a back stitch so that we have a nice tight seam when we pull off the paper pattern. The steps are repetitive in the rest of this unit, so I'll let you watch and I'll come back at the end of this unit. We've finished our Unit G. Now we're going to trim around the edges. We're going to give ourselves a 1/4 inch seam allowance as shown on the pattern. On the back of this pattern, the strings usually pop out, so I usually just trim all the strings at the end. I love this pattern because it's such an intricate piece and it makes it look precise and just beautiful. For Unit I, it's similar to several of the other units, but we'll work through it. First thing you're going to do is grab your cardstock and fold on all of the lines. First thing we're going to do is grab our center piece. We make sure that it fits over our section 1, and we're going to fold on the line between section 1 and section 2. I'm going to grab my scissors and just trim to a 1/4 inch seam next to the fold. Place my section 2 fabric, hold it with both hands and take it to the sewing machine. Remember that the black dot represents a back stitch. We need to make sure we have our back stitch so that we have a nice taut seam when we pull off our paper pattern. After we press our section 2 fabric down, we're going to trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take our section 3 fabric, line it up with our seam allowance, and sew that together. The rest of this unit is repetitive, so I'll let you watch and I'll come back at the end of this unit. Now that we've finished this unit, we will trim around the entire unit, leaving our 1/4 inch seam allowance as the pattern shows. This is one of the pieces that I love. It has detail in it and it looks precise and it looks beautiful. Okay, unit J is our last unit for this tutorial. It's one of our larger units for this pattern. You want to make sure you use your cardstock to fold on all the lines and fold all the way across the pattern. This one's a little bit unique also because it has a triangle in the middle of the pattern. With the triangle piece, I rough cut my fabric always in a rectangle so that I know that I will hit the entire section and make sure it's covered. I'm going to line up my 2 fabric pieces. Line it up on the fold of section 1 and section 2 with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Use both hands to take it to the machine and very carefully put it under the needle. Sometimes with these bigger units, I think my biggest issue would be that I switch directions of my fabric. Instead of going vertical, I might go horizontal or vice versa. So just make sure that as you do your bigger units, you make sure that your fabric is faced the right way. You'll see that these trimmings are large scrap pieces. Don't throw those away. Keep a bag that you put all your scraps in. If you can't use them for another project, then I use them as filling in things such as a pillow or other projects. The rest of the steps in this unit are repetitive, so I'll let you watch and I'll come back at the end of the unit. Now that our unit is finished, we'll trim the edges. We're going to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. It is already on your pattern, so you just line up the line of your ruler onto the line of the pattern and you can cut that off. So whether you're doing larger units or smaller units, the steps are the same. They're precise and beautiful and easy to do. When you've finished all of your units, lay them out and make sure you've got all of them complete. When pulling the paper off, put your thumb on the seam and tear with the other hand. You might be nervous to tear where the seam is, but remember, you did your back stitch on all of your pieces, so it will stay taut and strong for years to come. Putting it all together. Follow these simple instructions in sewing your units together. Thanks for joining me on this Salt Lake Temple tutorial.